Did you know that while everyone was obsessing over Led Zeppelin and Pink Floyd, emphatic dozens of incredible rock bands were creating music that could have changed everything? When you saw this title, you probably wondered which bands I'm talking about, whether you actually know any of them, and if these so-called forgotten groups were really worth remembering. Here's the truth that will blow your mind. Some of the most innovative, powerful, and downright spectacular rock music of the 1970s came from bands that never got their moment in the spotlight. And today, I'm going to prove that several of these groups were actually better than the legends you worship. The 1970s weren't just about the big names everyone remembers. Behind the massive success stories of stadium-filling superstars, there was an entire underground movement of bands pushing boundaries, experimenting with sounds, and creating music that was decades ahead of its time. These weren't garage bands playing in basements. These were professional musicians with record deals, radio play, and devoted followings who simply got lost in the shuffle of music history. What makes this even more fascinating is that many of these bands influenced the very artists who became household names, yet somehow faded into obscurity themselves. The real tragedy isn't just that you've never heard of them. It's that modern rock music might have evolved completely differently if these bands had gotten the recognition they deserved. Wishbone Ash. Let's start our journey with Wishbone Ash. A British quartet that basically invented the twin guitar harmony sound that would later define bands like Thin Lizzy and Iron Maiden. Their 1971 album, Argus, was a masterpiece of melodic hard rock, featuring intricate guitar work that made Jimmy Page look like he was playing with mittens. The band's approach to weaving two lead guitars together created textures that were both heavy and beautiful, yet they never achieved the massive commercial success of their contemporaries. While other bands were focusing on individual guitar heroes, Wishbone Ash was proving that collaboration could create something far more powerful than any single virtuoso performance. Budgie, moving across the Atlantic, we encounter Budgie, a Welsh power trio that was essentially the missing link between Black Sabbath and Rush. Their combination of heavy riffs, complex time signatures, and mystical lyrics created a sound that was both accessible and progressive. Songs like Bread Fan and Napoleon Bona, Parts 1 and 2, demonstrated a level of musical sophistication that most bands of the era couldn't match. What's particularly tragic about Budgie's story is that Metallica later covered several of their songs, introducing a whole new generation to their music. But by then, it was too late for the original band to capitalize on the recognition. Pentangle. Then there's Pentangle, a British folk rock group that was doing genre fusion before anyone even knew what that meant. By combining traditional folk music with jazz improvisation and rock energy, they created something entirely unique. Their acoustic guitar work was revolutionary, and their arrangements were so complex that many musicians today still can't figure out how they achieve certain sounds. Pentangle proved that rock music didn't need to be loud and aggressive to be powerful. Sometimes the most revolutionary act was to strip everything down and focus on pure musical craftsmanship. Captain Beyond. Captain Beyond represents one of rock's greatest what-if stories. Formed by members of Deep Purple, Iron Butterfly, and Johnny Winter's band, this supergroup had all the ingredients for massive success. Their self-titled debut album was a psychedelic masterpiece that bridged the gap between the experimental 60s and the harder 70s sound. The problem was timing. By 1972, the music industry was moving away from psychedelia, and Captain Beyond's complex, otherworldly compositions were too sophisticated for mainstream radio. They were making progressive rock before prog rock was cool, and by the time the genre gained acceptance, they had already disbanded. Free is perhaps the most heartbreaking story on this list because they actually had a massive hit with All Right Now. But their broader catalog remained largely unexplored by the general public. Paul Rodgers' voice was arguably better than Robert Plant's, And Paul Kossoff's guitar work was more emotionally resonant than most of the celebrated axemen of the era. Their album Fire and Water contains some of the most powerful blues rock ever recorded, yet most people only know that one song. Free's influence on later rock bands was enormous. Without them, there would be no Bad Company, no Foreigner, and arguably no arena rock as we know it. Cactus. Cactus emerged from the ashes of Vanilla Fudge.
Porque la terapia ayuda, pero la música suena más cabrón.
With a mission to create the heaviest, most uncompromising rock music possible. Their cover of Parchman Farm was so intense, it made Led Zeppelin's heaviest tracks sound like lullabies. Carmine Appis's drumming was absolutely thunderous, and Rusty Day's vocals could shatter windows. The band was essentially creating what would later be called heavy metal, but they were doing it in 1970 when the term didn't even exist. Their live performances were legendary for their sheer volume and intensity, yet they never achieved the commercial success that their innovation deserved. Atomic Rooster, Atomic Rooster, led by former Crazy World of Arthur Brown keyboardist Vincent Crane, created a dark, organ-driven sound that was both haunting and powerful. Their use of Hammond organ as a lead instrument was revolutionary, predating Deep Purple's similar approach by several years. Songs like Tomorrow Night and Death Walks Behind You showcased a level of musical darkness that wouldn't become mainstream until the gothic rock movement of the 80s. Vincent Crane's compositions were complex and emotionally intense, dealing with themes of death, spirituality, and human struggle in ways that most rock bands wouldn't dare attempt. UFO represents one of the most criminally underrated bands in rock history. Featuring guitarist Michael Schenker, whose technical prowess rivaled anyone in the genre. Their album Phenomenon contained guitar work so innovative that it influenced everyone from Iron Maiden to Metallica. Yet they never achieved mainstream success in America. Phil Mogg's vocals were powerful and distinctive, perfectly complementing Schenker's soaring lead guitar lines. The band's combination of hard rock power and progressive complexity created a sound that was both accessible and sophisticated, making their obscurity even more puzzling. Humble Pie, fronted by former Small Faces vocalist Steve Marriott, created some of the most intense blues rock of the early 70s. Marriott's voice was a force of nature, capable of both tender ballad delivery and earth-shaking power that made Robert Plant sound restrained. Their live album Performance Rockin' the Fillmore captured a raw energy that few bands could match, yet they struggled with inconsistent studio albums and internal conflicts. The tragedy of Humble Pie was that they had all the ingredients for superstardom, but could never quite put it all together at the right moment. Uriah Heap. Uriah Heap mastered the art of theatrical hard rock.
There I was on a July morning.
Before anyone knew what that meant, combining fantasy lyrics with powerful guitar work and soaring vocal harmonies. Their early albums like Very Evie, Very Humble, and Salisbury showcased a band that understood both the power of heavy riffs and the importance of melodic sophistication. Ken Hensley's keyboard work added a classical element that elevated their sound above typical hard rock, while David Byron's operatic vocals gave their songs an epic quality that influenced countless progressive and symphonic metal bands. Mountain was essentially the blueprint for every power trio that followed. With Leslie West's massive guitar tone and Felix Pappalardi's thunderous bass, creating a wall of sound that was both heavy and musical. Their performance at Woodstock should have launched them into the stratosphere, but somehow they remained a cult favorite rather than achieving the massive success their talent deserved. West's guitar playing was innovative and powerful, proving that you didn't need speed to create impact. Sometimes the most devastating musical moments came from knowing exactly when to hold back. Blood rock. Blood rock created some of the darkest, most intense rock music of the early 70s, with songs that explored themes of death and violence in ways that made Black Sabbath look optimistic. Their hit, DOA, was a 7-minute journey through a car crash, victims' dying thoughts, complete with sound effects and musical arrangements that were genuinely disturbing. The band's willingness to explore genuinely dark territory, both lyrically and musically, made them pioneers of what would later become doom metal, yet they never received credit for their innovations. Bang.
Been a hell of a ride, but I'm thinking it's time to grow.
Bang emerged from Philadelphia with a sound that was heavier and more aggressive than almost anything else being produced in America at the time. Their self-titled debut album contained guitar work that wouldn't sound out of place on a modern metal record, proving that American bands could be just as heavy as their British counterparts. Frank Ferrara's guitar playing was innovative and powerful, while the rhythm section provided a foundation that was both solid and creative. Their obscurity is particularly frustrating because they were creating music that was decades ahead of its time. Dust. Dust was a power trio from New York that created some of the heaviest, most uncompromising rock music of the early 70s. Their 2 albums showcased a band that understood the power of simplicity, stripping rock music down to its essential elements and then amplifying everything to maximum intensity. Richie Wise's guitar work was both powerful and creative, while the rhythm section provided a foundation that was absolutely crushing. Their influence on later stoner rock and doom metal bands is undeniable, yet they remained virtually unknown outside of collector circles. Sir Lord Baltimore, Sir Lord Baltimore rounds out our list as one of America's earliest and heaviest proto-metal bands, creating music so intense that it practically invented the genre single-handedly. Their 1971 album, Kingdom Come, featured guitar work that was absolutely crushing, with John Garner's riffs providing a blueprint for everything from doom metal to thrash. The band's combination of blues-based songwriting and extreme volume created something entirely new. Yet they disbanded after just 2 albums, leaving behind a legacy that would only be fully appreciated decades later by metal historians and collectors. The story of these forgotten bands reveals a larger truth about the music industry of the 1970s. Success wasn't always about talent or innovation. It was often about timing, marketing, and sheer luck. Many of these groups were making music that was ahead of its time, exploring territories that wouldn't become commercially viable for years or even decades. They were the pioneers, the risk-takers, the artists who pushed boundaries while the more famous bands played it safe and reaped the rewards. What makes this particularly frustrating is that several of these bands directly influenced the very artists who became superstars. You can hear Wishbone Ash's twin guitar approach in every Iron Maiden song. Budgie's progressive metal experiments laid the groundwork for everything from Rush to Dream Theater. Free's emotional blues rock became the template for stadium rock ballads. Yet somehow, the originators got left behind while their students became millionaires. These 15 bands weren't just footnotes in rock history, they were the real innovators, the true pioneers who dared to experiment while others played it safe. Every single one of them created music that was decades ahead of its time, and every single one of them deserves to be remembered, not as forgotten relics, but as the visionaries they truly were. The next time someone tells you the 70s were only about the big names everyone knows, you'll know they're dead wrong. Now stop what you're doing and go listen to Wishbone Ash's Argus album right now. Your entire understanding of what guitar music can be is about to change forever, and once you hear it, you'll never be able to listen to classic rock the same way again.